The Chartist Movement by Karl Marx, published August 25, 1852. While the Tories, the Whigs, the Peelites, in fact all the parties we have hitherto commented upon below, more or less to the past, the Free Traders are the official representatives of modern English society, the representatives of that England which rules the market of the world. They represent the party of the self-conscious bourgeoisie of industrial capital striving to make available its social power as a political power as well, and to eradicate the last arrogant remnant of feudal society. This party is led on by the most active and most energetic portion of the English bourgeoisie, the manufacturers. What they demand is the complete and undisguised ascendancy of the bourgeoisie, the open, official subjection of society at large under the laws of modern bourgeois production and under the rule of those men who are the directors of that production. By free trade they mean the unfettered movement of capital, freed from all political, national, and religious shackles. The soil is to be a marketable commodity, and the exploitation of the soil is to be carried on according to the common commercial laws. There are to be manufacturers of food as well as manufacturers of twist and cottons, but no longer any lords of the land. There are, in short, not to be tolerated any political or social restrictions, regulations, or monopolies unless they proceed from the eternal laws of political economy, that is, from the conditions under which capital produces and distributes. The struggle of this party against the old English institutions, products of a superannuated and evanescent stage of social development, is resumed in the watchword, produce as cheap as you can, and do away with all the fou-fray of production. And this watchword is addressed not only to the private individual, but to the nation at large principally. Royalty, with its barbarous splendors, its court, its civil list, its flunkies, what else does it belong to but to the fou-fray of production? The nation can produce and exchange without royalty, away with the crown. The sinecures of the nobility, the House of Lords, fou-fray of production. The large standing army, fou-frays of production. The colonies, fou-fray of production. The state church, with its riches, the spoils of plunder or of mendicity, fou-fray of production. Let parsons compete freely with each other, and everyone pay them according to his own wants. The whole circumstantial routine of English law, with its courts of Sir Chancery, fou-fray of production. National wars, fou-frays of production. England can exploit foreign nations more cheaply while at peace with them. You see, to these champions of the British bourgeoisie, to the men of the Manchester School, every institution of Old England appears in the light of a piece of machinery as costly as it is useless, and which fulfills no other purpose but to prevent the nation from producing the greatest possible quantity at the least possible expense, and to exchange its products in freedom. Necessarily, their last word is the bourgeois republic, in which free competition rules supreme in all spheres of life, in which there remains altogether that minimum only of government, which is indispensable for the administration internally and externally of the common class interests and business of the bourgeoisie, and where this minimum of government is, as soberly, as economically organized as possible, such a party in other countries would be called democratic. But it is necessarily revolutionary, and the complete annihilation of Old England as an aristocratic country is the end which it follows up with more or less consciousness. Its nearest object, however, is the attainment of a parliamentary reform which should transfer to its hands the legislative power necessary for such a revolution. But the British bourgeois are not excitable Frenchmen. When they intend to carry a parliamentary reform, they will not make a revolution of February. On the contrary, having obtained in 1846 a grand victory over the landed aristocracy, by the repeal of the Corn Laws, they were satisfied with following up the material advantages of this victory, while they neglected to draw the necessary political and economical conclusions from it, and thus enabled the Whigs to reinstate themselves into their hereditary monopoly of government. During all the time from 1846 to 1852, they exposed themselves to ridicule by their battle cry, broad principles, and practical measures. And why all this? Because in every violent movement they are obliged to appeal to the working class, and if the aristocracy is their vanishing opponent, the working class is their rising enemy, they prefer to compromise with their vanishing opponent rather than to strengthen their rising enemy, to whom the future belongs, by concessions of more than apparent importance. Therefore, they strive to avoid every forcible collision with the aristocracy, but historical necessity and the Tories press them onwards. They cannot avoid fulfilling their mission, battering to pieces old England, the England of the past, and the very moment when they will have conquered exclusive political dominion, when political dominion and economical supremacy will be united in the same hands, when therefore the struggle against capital will no longer be distinct from the struggle against existing government. From that very moment will date the social revolution of England. We now come to the Chartists, the politically active portion of the British working class. The 6 points of the Charter which they contend for contain nothing but the demand of universal suffrage and of the conditions without which universal suffrage would be illusory for the working class, such as the ballot, payment of members, annual general elections. But universal suffrage is the equivalent for political power for the working class of England, where the proletariat form the large majority of the population, wherein a long, though battle, civil war, it has gained a clear consciousness of its position as a class, and where even the rural districts know no longer any peasants, but landlords, industrial capitalists, and hired laborers. The carrying of universal suffrage in England would therefore be a far more socialistic measure than anything which has been honored with that name on the continent. Its inevitable result here is the political supremacy of the working class. I shall report on another occasion on the revival and reorganization of the Chartist party. For the present, I have only to treat of the recent election. To be a voter for the British Parliament, a man must occupy, in the boroughs, a house rated at £10 to the poor's rate, and in the counties he must be a freeloader to the annual amount of 40 shillings, or a leaseholder to the amount of £50. From this statement alone, it follows that the Chartists could take officially but little part in the electoral battle just concluded. In order to explain the actual part they took in it, I must recall to mind a peculiarity of the British electoral system: nomination day and declaration day, show of hands and poll. When candidates have made their appearance on the day of election and have publicly harangued the people, they are elected in the first instance by the show of hands, and every hand has the right to be raised, the hand of the non-elector as well as that of the elector. For whomever the majority of the hands are raised, that person is declared by the returning officer to be elected by show of hands, but now the medal shows its reverse. The election by show of hands was a mere ceremony, an act of formal politeness toward the sovereign people, and the politeness ceases as soon as privilege is menaced. For if the show of hands does not return the candidates of the privileged electors, these candidates demand a poll. Only the privileged electors can take part in the poll, and whosoever has there the majority of votes is declared duly elected. The first election by show of hands is a show satisfaction allowed for a moment to public opinion in order to convince it the next moment the more strikingly of its impotency. It might appear that this election by show of hands, this dangerous formality, had been invented in order to ridicule universal suffrage, and to enjoy some little aristocratic fun at the expense of the rabble. But this would be a delusion, and the old usage, common originally to all Teutonic nations, could drag itself traditionally down to the 19th century because it gave to the British class parliament, cheaply and without danger, an appearance of popularity. The ruling classes drew from this usage the satisfaction that the mass of the people took part, with more or less passion, in their sectional interests as its national interests. And it was only since the bourgeoisie took an independent station at the side of the two official parties, the Whigs and the Tories, that the working masses stood up on the nomination days in their own name. But in no former year has the contrast of show of hands and poll, of nomination day and declaration day, been so serious, so well defined by opposed principles, so threatened, so general upon the whole surface of the country, as in this last election of 1852. And what a contrast! It was sufficient to be named by show of hands in order to be beaten at the poll. It was sufficient to have had the majority at a poll in order to be saluted by the people with rotten apples and brickbats. The duly elected members of Parliament before all had a great deal to do in order to keep their own parliamentary bodily selves in safety. On one side the majority of the people, on the other the 12th part of the whole population, and the 5th part of the sum total of the male adult inhabitants of the country. On one side enthusiasm, on the other side bribery. On one side, parties disowning their own distinctive signs, liberals pleading the conservatism, conservatives proclaiming the liberalism of their views; on the other, the people proclaiming their presence and pleading their own cause. On one side, a worn-out engine, which, turning incessantly in its vicious circle, is never able to move a single step forward, and the impotent process of friction by which all the official parties gradually grind each other into dust. On the other, the advancing mass of the nation, threatening to blow up the vicious circle and to destroy the official engine. I shall not follow up over all the surface of the country this contrast between nomination and poll, of the threatening electoral demonstration of the working class, and the timid electioneering maneuvers of the ruling classes. I take one borough from the mass, where the contrast is concentrated in a focus: the Halifax election. Here the opposing candidates were Edwards, Sir Charles Wood, Frank Crossley, and finally Ernest Jones, the most talented, consistent, and energetic representative of Chartism. Halifax being a manufacturing town, the Tory had little chance. The Manchester man, Crossley, was leagued with the Whigs. The serious struggle, then, lay only between Wood and Jones, between the Whig and the Chartist. Sir Charles Wood made a speech about half an hour, perfectly inaudible at the commencement, and during its latter half, to the disapprobation of the immense multitude. His speech, as reported by the reporter who sat close to him, was merely a recapitulation of the free trade measures passed, and an attack on Lord Derby's government, and a laudation of the unexampled prosperity of the country and the people. He did not propound one single new measure of reform, and but faintly, in very few words, hinted at Lord John Russell's bill for the franchise. I give a more extensive abstract of Ernest Jones' speech, as you will not find it in any of the great London ruling class papers. Ernest Jones, who was received with immense enthusiasm, then spoke as follows: Electors and non-electors, you have met upon a great and solemn festival. To date, the Constitution recognizes universal suffrage in theory, that it may perhaps deny it in practice on the morrow. Today, the representatives of two systems stand before you, and you have to decide beneath which you shall be ruled for 7 years. 7 years! A little life! I summon you to pause upon the threshold of those 7 years. Today they shall pass slowly and calmly in review before you. Today decide, you 20,000 men, that perhaps 500 may undo your will tomorrow. I say the representatives of two systems stand before you. Whig, Tory, and moneymongers are on my left. It is true, but they are all as one. The moneymonger says, buy cheap and sell dear. The Tory says, buy dear and sell dearer. Both are the same for the labor. But the former system is in the ascendant, and the pauperism rankles at its root. That system is based on foreign competition. Now, I assert that under the buy cheap and sell dear principle brought to bear on foreign competition, the ruin of the working and small trading classes must go on. Why? Labor is the creator of all wealth. A man must work before a grain is grown or a yard is woven. But there is no self-employment for the working man in this country. Labor is a hired commodity. Labor is a thing in the market that is bought and sold. Consequently, as labor creates all wealth, labor is the first thing bought. Buy cheap, buy cheap. Labor is bought in the cheapest market. But now comes the next. Sell dear, sell dear. Sell what? Labor's produce. To whom? To the foreigner. Aye, and to the laborer himself. For labor, not being self-employed, the laborer is not the partaker of the first fruits of his toil. Buy cheap, sell dear. How do you like it? Buy cheap, sell dear. Buy the working man's labor cheaply, and sell it back to that very working man, the produce of his own labor, dear. The principle of inherent loss is in the bargain. The employer buys the labor cheap he sells, and on the sale he must make a profit. He sells to the working man himself, and thus every bargain between the employer and the employed is a deliberate cheat on the part of the employer. Thus labor has to sink through eternal loss, that capital may rise through lasting fraud. But the system stops not here. This is brought to bear on foreign competition, which means we must ruin the trade of other countries as we have ruined the labor of our own. How does it work? The high-taxed country has to undersell the low-taxed. Competition abroad is constantly increasing. Consequently, cheapness must increase constantly also. Therefore, wages in England must keep constantly falling. And how do they effect the fall? By surplus labor. And how do they obtain the surplus labor? By monopoly of the land, which drives more hands than are wanted into the factory. By monopoly of machinery, which drives those hands into the street. By women labor, which drives the man from the shuttle. By child labor, which drives the women from the loom. Then, planting their foot upon that living base of surplus, they press its aching heart beneath their heel and cry, starvation! Who will work? A half-loaf is better than no bread at all, and the writhing mass grasps greedily at their terms. Such is the system of the working man. But electors, how does it operate on you? How does it affect home trade, the shopkeeper, poor's rate, and taxation? For every increase of competition abroad, there must be an increase of cheapness at home. Every increase of cheapness in labor is based on increase of labor surplus, and this surplus is obtained by an increase of machinery. I repeat, how does this operate on you? The Manchester Liberal on my left establishes a new patent and throws 300 men as a surplus in the streets. Shopkeepers, 300 customers less. Ratepayers, 300 paupers more. But mark me, the evil stops not there. These 300 men operate first to bring down the wages of those who remain at work in their own trade. The employer says, "Now I reduce your wages." The men demur. Then he adds, "Do you see these 300 men who have just walked out? You may change places if you like. They are sighing to come in on any terms, for they are starving." The men feel it, and are crushed. Oh, you Manchester Liberal, Pharisee of politics, those men are listening. Have I got you now? But the evil stops not yet. Those men, driven from their own trade, seek employment in others when they swell the surplus and bring wages down. The low-paid trades of today were high-paid once, and the high-paid of today will be the low-paid soon. Thus, the purchasing power of the working class is diminished every day, and with it dies home trade. Market, shopkeepers, your customers grow poorer and your profits less, while your paupers grow more numerous and your poor rates and your taxes rise. Your receipts are smaller, your expenditure is more large. You get less and pay more. How do you like the system? On you, the rich manufacturer and landlord throws the weight of the poor's rate and taxation. Men of the middle class, are you the tax-paying machine of the rich? They create the poverty that creates their riches, and they make you pay for the poverty that they created. The landlord escapes it by privilege, the manufacturer by repaying himself out of the wages of his men, and that reacts on you. How do you like the system? Well, that is the system upheld by the gentleman on my left. What then do I propose? I have shown the wrong. That is something. But I do more. I stand here to show the right and prove it so. Ernest Jones then went on to expose his own views on political and economical reform, and continued as follows. Electors and non-electors, I have now brought before you some of the social and political measures, the immediate adoption of which I advocated now as I did in 1847. But because I tried to extend your liberties, mine were curtailed. Because I tried to rear the temple of freedom for you all, I was thrown into the cell of a felon's jail, and there on my left sits one of my chief jailers. Because I tried to give voice to truth, I was condemned to silence. For 2 years and 1 week he cast me into a prison in solitary confinement on the silent system, without pen, ink, or paper, but oakum picking as a substitute. Ah, it was your turn for 2 years and 1 week. It is mine this day. I summon the angel of retribution from the heart of every Englishman here present. Hark, you feel the fanning of his wings in the breath of this vast multitude. You may say this is not a public question, but it is. It is a public question for the man who cannot feel for the wife of the prisoner, will not feel for the wife of the working man. He who will not feel for the children of the captive will not feel for the children of the labor slave. His past life proves it. His promise of today does not contradict it. Who voted for Irish coercion, the gagging bill, and the tampering with the Irish press? The Whig. There he sits. Turn him out. Who voted 15 times against Hume's motion for the franchise, lock kings on the counties, Ewart's for short parliaments, and Berkeley's for the ballot? The Whig. There he sits. Turn him out. Who voted against the release of Frost, Williams, and Jones? The Whig. There he is. Turn him out. Who voted against reducing the Duke of Cambridge's salary of £12,000, against all reductions in the Army and Navy, against the repeal of the window tax, and 48 times against every other reduction of taxation, his own salary included? The Whig. There he sits. Turn him out. Who voted against the repeal of the paper duty, and the advertisement duty, and the taxes on knowledge? The Whig. There he sits. Turn him out. Who voted for batches of new bishops, vicar rare, the Maynooth grant, against its reduction and against absolving dissenters from paying church rates? The Whig. There he sits. Turn him out. Who voted against all inquiry into adulteration of food? The Whig. There he sits. Turn him out. Who voted against lowering the duty on sugar and repealing the tax on malt? The Whig. There he sits. Turn him out. Who voted against shortening the night work of bakers, against inquiry into the conditions of framework knitters, against medical inspectors of workhouses, against preventing little children from working before 6 in the morning, against parish relief for the pregnant women of the poor, and against the 10 hours bill? The Whig. There he sits. Turn him out. Turn him out in the name of humanity and of God. Men of Halifax, men of England, the two systems are before you. Now judge and choose. It is impossible to describe the enthusiasm kindled by this speech, especially at the close. The voice of the vast multitude, held in breathless suspense during each paragraph, came at each pause like the thunder of a returning wave in execration of the representative of Whiggery and class rule. Altogether, it was a scene that will long be unforgotten. On the show of hands being taken, very few, and those chiefly of the hired or intimidated, were held up for Sir C. Wood. But Almost everyone present raised both hands for Ernest Jones, amidst cheering and enthusiasm it would be impossible to describe. The mayor declared Mr. Ernest Jones and Mr. Henry Edwards to be elected by show of hands. Sir C. Wood and Mr. Crosley then demanded a poll. What Jones had predicted took place. He was nominated by 20,000 votes, but the Whig and the Manchester Man were elected by 500 votes.